So finally, when we look at Solomon, we would be remiss to look at his life without looking at some of the things he wrote. So what did Solomon contribute to the scriptures?
Book of Proverbs probably is most well known, but also Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon as well.
Yeah, and when we look at the writings of Solomon, what impression do you take away from?
All about wisdom. I should say a lot of it really focuses on wisdom. Obviously, the book of Proverbs are really just a display of wisdom. But the book of Ecclesiastes, really a unique book in all of Scripture, but it comes from somebody who's had an opportunity to try everything, so to speak, and really be able to kind of figure out what's worth anything.
Yeah, there's some interesting aspects to what Solomon has written, and one of those interesting aspects, I think, is that Solomon wants to be wise. Is there any kind of danger in wanting to be wise?
There can be. Obviously, a little bit of that was the temptation given by the serpent in the garden and led to the downfall of Adam and Eve. And one way to look at that was a premature desire for this wisdom. But also even Solomon talks about, in the book of Ecclesiastes of reading books can just be toilsome and vanity.
Right. Yeah, I see in looking at especially Ecclesiastes, I see that there's basically two ways of gaining wisdom, and one of them, you can think about a little child, and the parent says to the child, "Don't touch the stove; it's hot." And there are two ways of gaining wisdom in that situation, and one of them is to not touch the stove, and you gain the wisdom by not experiencing the problems with touching the stove. You're free from the consequence. However, most of us eschew that route, and the second way is to touch the stove and to find out through the pain and suffering that comes from it that you shouldn't have done that. And as you mentioned in the garden, I think that Adam and Eve chose option two. They decided that they were going to touch the stove, so to speak, and they got burned, and all of us got burned along with them. But I see something similar going on with Solomon, is that he starts off by listening to God and doing what God says, and then he breaks every one of the commandments that God has around being king, and he suffers the consequence. And really, what's fascinating to me is when you read the book of Ecclesiastes, it's a book of wisdom, but it's not joyful.
Yeah.
And really, that lack of joy seems to come from the fact that it's basically like his life has become a warning sign.
Well, it's interesting, early on when he asks God for wisdom, it's a desire to have this ability to serve God's people well. But later on, it seems it gets very introspective, inward focused, and it becomes all about him, and definitely comes off the rails pretty quickly.
Yeah, and you see that in pursuing things for himself, it's not that they made him happy. They didn't bring him any joy. He finds the emptiness of all those things, and that's really, I think, should be instructive for us as Christians, is to say, hey, wait a second, there's two ways we can approach this. Now, Song of Solomon is an interesting book from the standpoint of it appears to be just kind of Hebrew romance literature, but is there any more to it than that?
I'm under the impression that at different stages in Israel's history that you weren't allowed to read this book until you were like 30 or something. But I'm also familiar with the idea that it's an analogy of Christ in the church, and Christ and his bride, if you will, as well.
Yeah, some have also seen in it a picture of the relationship of the king to wisdom. And I find that kind of an interesting idea, given Solomon's life and the way that he pursued wisdom for such a long time. And, the book of Proverbs kind of has a very similar picture in it of the relationship of wisdom to a person, wisdom as a woman, and calling out, and a pursuit of her is a good thing, and things like that.
I found it interesting, and maybe a good concluding remark, that Solomon, who got so focused on himself and things of this sort, in all of Ecclesiastes, she sums it up. There are a couple things that weren't vanity, and it was love and honor God and love the wife of your youth.
Yeah.
And those are not inward focused.